Hello and welcome everybody. If I could get someone to confirm my audio, that would be really nice. I can see that you're already on the chat. That's also super nice to see. I think you know by now that we love to see where you're checking in from. So feel free to let us know where you're coming from, which country you're watching from, and who you represent. It's really nice. Thank you for confirming my audio as well. Really nice to see some familiar faces on the chat. We are here to talk about summer mappings today, a topic that we're excited about every year. So I won't be doing too much of an introduction. We have two familiar faces today, Jacob, as you know and love, and Alice, as you also know and love, hopefully. So I'll
Thank
hand I'll hand the floor over to you guys and let you do your introduction yourself.
thank you so much, Frederica, and we are quite excited to
Very
get
excited.
started today. Summer is really coming, at least here to Denmark. We're starting to feel the warm weather, and that also means that we start getting a lot of questions regarding summer mappings.
Exactly. More
Yeah.
and more, we can see that more people are reaching out to us for tips, tricks, and suggestions about how to handle
Mhm.
summer mappings, and that's what this webinar is about, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So really today we're gonna talk about summer mappings and some of the guidelines and some of the experiences we've had, because we in GxP we perform hundreds of mappings each year, if not thousands. And we'll take some of those experiences, some of that feedback we got from customers, from auditors, from different governmental bodies, and compile them down to a series of points that might be interesting in the field of temperature mapping within the summer. So, but who are we?
Exactly. Who are we?
Yeah.
So, my name is Ale Shukmar. I'm the head of business development here at GxP. I've been part of GxP for more than 4.5 years now. And I have a background in different industry, both engineering, hospitality, and finally now basically pharma distribution, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and my name is Jacob Conradsen, and I'm the head of quality here at GxP. And I've been parts of hundreds of temperature mappings. We've seen both the good, the bad, and the ugly. My background is in electronic engineering and instrumentation and spacecraft design. For the last 13 years, I've been working here at GxP, where we're constantly developing on solutions that fit the GxP industries. So who are we here at GxP then, Alex?
Exactly. Let's start with that. So, what is GxP? Who are we? GxP, as some of you know already, it's basically a one-stop solution for temperature compliance in GxP environments. What this means, so UPRI provides multiple systems, multiple solutions that covers from mapping activities, monitoring, validations of unit, but also calibration. Basically, what we want to achieve here is kind of to give you straight out of the box service compliance agreement so that you can be compliant at all the time without worries. We do have, actually, that sounds awesome, but it's not as simple as it might look. We do have multiple teams working in the background. So we have an engineering team that is always kind of working on mapping cases on a yearly basis. I don't think we ever had a quiet moment in the validation team.
That's a long time ago, at least.
Yeah, exactly. We do have a support team that is actually always ready to assist our customers, answer the phone, and solve problems. We do have also everything is the development team, because everything is developed in-house, which is the amazing thing. So hardware, software, calibration, validation, all under one single umbrella, which is UPRI.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Alex. So some of the, what are we actually going to talk about today?
Exactly. Yeah. So the agenda, these are the points that we'll cover today. Of course, to put everyone on the same kind of playing field, that we know what we're talking. So we'll go through the basics of the mapping process. What is the risk-based approach in mapping, which is kind of fundamental to understand why summer mapping is needed. And during after that, we'll go in the 5 considerations for a summer mapping that is kind of compliant with the GxP regulations, but also it answers some very basic questions, like, for example, when is summer? But then we'll go a bit more complex, like sun and radiation heating, outside the air temperatures, windows, how those affect a mapping exercise, equalizing product temperatures, and then we'll give you some hands-on examples. But as usual, we'll have at the end some Q&A time to answer, hopefully, most of your questions. We can't promise that we can answer all of them, but we'll definitely reach out to you after the webinar if we miss some of those.
Yeah, and as always, you're more than welcome to type in some questions in the chat function on the right of your screen. So we'll try to take some of the questions as we go. And also, I would like to emphasize that today we're not really trying to go into depth with the whole mapping exercise and all of the tests, but really focusing on what makes summer mapping special and what are some specific considerations you should have when performing a mapping during summertime. But I will let you start out, right, Alex?
Let's start. So, what is mapping and what is the mapping process? So, the mapping process is an exercise that we do it on an annual basis, or when we switch a unit or we buy a new unit, in order to assure that the unit itself is fit for the purpose that we intend to. And there are various phases that we need to go through in order to eventually kind of do a successful mapping exercise. And those stages are, of course, the installation qualification, then we have the operation qualification and the performance qualification. But specifically the mapping is, as you can see in the graph, is the last 2 points of the V model. Everything that comes beforehand is all the study, all the work that you have to do it before starting the exercise itself. So if I briefly just kind of introduce you to what is the operation qualification, is basically once we assure that the unit itself can be a fridge, freezer, incubator, also a warehouse, is kind of installed properly. So we plug the fridge into the electricity and it turns on, right? That's a good start. So basically following the user manual, installing the equipment, it is working as intended. We can check the box, and then we go into operation qualification, which means it's kind of, we do always need to store something in those units. Does the unit that we purchase or that we are validating it's able to actually perform on a level to store the perishable items that we want to store in it? So it is able to keep a specific temperature that we can then store the vaccines, for example, right? that's kind of basically what an operation qualification is, just to understand if the equipment that we purchase it's able to actually fulfill the minimal standards of storage of the goods that we want to store in it. But then we have also the performance qualification, which is a bit more complex here. Here, actually, what the validation engineers will say, the fun starts, right?
Yeah. The real
It's
fun
the
stuff.
real fun starts,
Yeah.
and it's basically a real life operations. So a fridge or a freezer, it's not always closed, right? So we'll be opening the fridge multiple times a day, most likely. Then the fridge itself, it's not always at full capacity. It's not always full, no, not always empty. Sometimes it's half empty. Those can deviate, like airflows, air patterns, and all that. So in the performance qualification, and here is kind of also the risk-based approach really comes handy, is where we try to kind of mimic and predict as close as possible the real-time use of the specific unit.
Absolutely.
I'll say that we can go
Yeah.
further. So in the mapping process, everything starts with a protocol. A protocol is basically your test plans, what we want to do, what we want to achieve. And here it's also important that we spend the right amount of time, because you don't want to be too wide with your intentions, but neither too narrow. And what I mean with that, so you need to have the right focus on the type of exercise that you want to perform, which is based on the type of goods that you want to store in this specific unit. So it's kind of very much going into the details of all the steps of the mapping exercise, from the usage that the unit will have, what kind of material will be storing inside, how we operate this unit on a day-to-day basis, etc. So kind of is basically laying down the whole plan as detailed as possible, including a risk-based method, in order to then go into the execution. Execution, as you might guess, is fairly simple. We follow the protocols, right?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. So, and here is kind of, I also forgot to mention the protocols. You also mentioned the equipment that you must use. What kind of equipment, how should be calibrated, what type of calibration you need. In the execution, besides kind of verifying that everything is aligned with the protocol, so verifying that the equipment that you're using is really what is mentioned in the protocol, you need to follow the guidelines on how to install the data loggers or the sensors around the unit. And then you start recording. You start recording the temperatures, and you start to, hopefully, if you have a real-time mapping, also constantly monitoring and analyzing the data that are coming in. So basically, the execution is placing the monitoring system or the data loggers and the sensors according to the protocol within the unit that you want to actually do the exercise. And then, of course, it's what is the less fun part, in my opinion, is the the reporting there.
Yeah.
So once you concluded your exercise, one thing that we have to point out, that a mapping exercise is an exercise that is kind of set in a period in time. So once you concluded this exercise, you have to extract all those data and understand what's happening. So the understanding and the ability of reading those data and get valuable informations is where the actual magic happens. It's where we rely heavily on the validation engineers and validation team to kind of understand these massive outputs of data, temperatures, temperature swings, and all that, to understand what is the real behavior of this unit overall.
Absolutely.
And to move forward, so the mapping process is, as you can see here in the different graphs, right, is in here it's kind of basically the placing in a standard area, right, is the placement of loggers and then the various tests that we do. For example, in this example, we do have like a standard racking where we place on different heights because usually a mapping exercise has to be conducted in a three-dimensional scheme. That means that you have to cover the various corners where the goods are stored, but also you have different type of area that are impacted in different way. So that means that maybe you have different entrances, maybe you have different goods stored on a different height based on their sensitivity. So this is what you want to understand from the environment that you go and conduct the study. And if we move forward to the next slide, here is kind of what is needed to kind of have kind of covered your mapping exercise with all the possible outcomes and risks that you want to kind of predict. This is the risk-based approach. The risk-based approach is usually structured through three main areas, right? One is the compliance risk, one is the technical risk, and then the operational risk. So the compliance risk is kind of it's the most, I think, bureaucratic and technical risk of the risk-based approach in this case.
Yeah, I think we would often see customers, and this is a model that we've developed here at GxP, and we would often see that the compliance risk are really related to, do you follow the standard or not, or do you follow the different guidelines or not? And often what we see is that you can deviate slightly from what the guidelines mandate, but you'll have to have some good risk assessments in place to in order to rationalize why you would deviate from the general guidelines, right? Yeah.
And that's why they're called also guidelines and not regulation, right? When we talk about mapping guidelines from the ISP to the WHO, those are guidelines which provides you kind of a frame where ideally you do your risk analysis and perform, and you use those as a railways in together with your risk analysis. We do have also the technical risk. Here is kind of being able to consider various uncertainty that can occur during the exercise itself. You have also, besides kind of having equipment failures as well. Maybe you do have also, besides the technical risk of equipment failure, you have also the inability of following certain practices and protocols to execute efficiently the mapping exercise itself. So in the technical risk here, we really want to include everything that can go wrong from a technical perspective here. From the knowledge that our staff is having, if we have trained enough, if we worked enough on our protocols, if we got the right equipment, anything else that would you add in the technical risk?
Yeah, and often we would also see that for summer mapping specifically, technical risk can play a huge role because it could also be doors and gates and forklift charges, any sort of technical installations that could impact the stability and the homogeneity of the space we're trying to map. So it's really a lot about seeing the sort of infrastructure of the building or the infrastructure of a smaller temperature controlled unit, but really trying to emphasize on the technical part versus the operational and compliance risk. And it shows really nicely to the auditor that you understand that there are different aspects to your risk assessment that you're both considering compliance, technical, and operational, as those are not often linked, but it can be categorized differently, right?
Exactly. And while the operational risk is kind of when we need to combine everything in a kind of day-to-day setting, right? Which besides being kind of, where is the positioning of the doors, forklift charges and all that, but how long those doors are open. When the forklift is coming in, it's a diesel forklift or it's an electric forklift. How long, how often happens that a certain door is left open, how many times you can open in one specific time. So basically it's kind of you in the operational risk, you should consider everything that fits into your daily use of the specific unit. And bigger the unit, more complex is this part to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So underlying risk.
Underlying risk.
Yeah.
So Continuing with the risk-based approach, so we have the underlying risk, and here is kind of necessary to understand those, because it's kind of the homogeneity and the stability of the unit itself. So that's why kind of having more measuring points, for example, and being understand how to some extent thermodynamics works in a space is very important, because not every space is homogeneous or stable as you might think. Just think about when compressor kicks in and the air vent starts to blowing cold air in a specific area, then you have one specific point that it's way colder than the rest of the room. If you move forward, then we have the external influences, right? And here I'll need a bit your help, because it can be different factors here. An external influence is also definitely the weather.
Absolutely.
It's the environment, and this is what we are talking here. But it's not only that. It can be also, if we talk from a bigger structure, it is south or it's north oriented, and how this influence in the different seasonality.
Yeah, and one thing is seasonality is really we're going to talk about today, but it's important to understand also connected walls, for example. If you have a frozen storage very close to an ambient storage, that might have an impact. And
True.
it's really important for you to be able to show that to the auditor, that you've taken those risks into account, and that you understand that one thing is that there are general placement recommendations from the guidelines, but those are based on underlying risk. And if you understand the underlying risk, you're way better off in terms of preparing the protocol. Yeah.
Exactly. Then I covered a tiny bit the last part, the non-conform on blowout air in the homogeneity and stability. I think those two things are kind of fairly connected to some extent. Even that I forgot to mention that homogeneity and stability can be widely impacted if room is loaded, empty, or half empty. So it's also, again, here is about airstreams, thermodynamics, but also kind of fine-tuning your equipment, your HVAC system here. That will, and actually a risk-based approach will guide you through all the weak points of your plan in this case. So a non-optimal temperature control, that's exactly what I was saying here. That might be maybe very much kind of ruin your starting point of the exercise if it's completely out of range that you should be in. And the local heat or cold zones, this is again connecting to the homogeneity of a space and stability. Depends on the room, the HVAC system, and all of that. But the vents and all that, of course, can sometimes destabilize specific spots, generating areas that are actually they're not conforming to the specifics of the goods that you need to store.
Absolutely.
And then we have, based on that, we can figure out together, using together the specifics of the guidelines, the general placement and recommendations. And here in this kind of little graph that I think our colleague Niels gently put it together, it's kind of an example where are the risk areas in a warehouse, for example. You have the various entrances, you have doors, you have the HVAC system that is positioned centrally, but then you have also forklift chargers that actually produce quite an exceptional amount of heat, to be honest. And all of that impacts the airflows. So once we find out what are these kind of areas with a higher risk of being kind of destabilizing of our exercise, then we combine this with the regulations, not regulation, but with the guidelines in order to make a GxP compliant mapping exercise.
Absolutely. And moving on from there it is.
So
What are our consideration? Why should we care about all these things during summer? Why is it really different from summer than to winter?
I think a lot of things are obvious,
Yeah.
but some of them not not that, because there are a lot of consideration to put into it. So when is summer? That's kind of to understand. That doesn't mean there has to be the 15th of August at noon, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We'll go through exactly what summer means in the GxP environment. Moving on is the sun and radiation heating. Here will be, that's your duty, to go a bit more in detail how basically radiation, sun can affect the distribution of heat within specifically a building in a warehouse. And the next one, we do have outside air temperature, how this one also impacts the exercise itself. And the various windows, because especially when we go, when we consider a bigger space like a warehouse, we have multiple windows, how they're oriented, as I mentioned before, they're south, they're north, that's a different type of risk in itself. And equalizing product temperatures, so the distribution of the various goods that we need to store.
Absolutely.
So
Why do we need to do summer mapping, Alex?
why we do? Because it's warm, I would say. No. So summer mappings, why? Specifically in the life science industry, we do have a lot of temperature sensitive material. And obviously summer being kind of the hottest and warmest season, it just makes sense that we do an exercise during those peak seasons. But the same is also in winter. We'll talk probably there in November about it.
Yeah.
But during summer, it's because it's one of the two seasons that are actually the most extreme conditions in the surrounding environment. So the various considerations here. How warm is actually outside? So that will help us to define, okay, what is the best period to do a summer mapping? The various other considerations are radiation, heating, and highly utilized HVAC system. And here we can talk a lot because a proper summer mapping, it can be really beneficial, not only from a compliance point of view, but also in optimizing your HVAC system and honestly reduce the ongoing cost of maintaining your units in an optimal state. But a bit more about that later on. So when is summer?
So I think before we dive into the specifics of it, we actually do have just a small poll. We're considering here in UPRI to make a training, sort of a training digital course where you can learn in your self-pace. So I'll just start a poll here, and if you would like, it would be great to get your feedback on whether you would be interested in attending such a training session. But back to you. Sorry, Alex. We'll just let that run on the side.
And that's my last slide. Then the stage is all yours. So when is summer? If you can click here, we have a little diagram on basically the average temperatures in Copenhagen, Denmark, where actually we are located right now. I know for many Southern European people that looks very sad, but that's the Danish summer. Peak temperature slightly above 20 degrees Celsius. But as you can see, the distribution of those average temperatures are not focused in just a couple of weeks, right? So you need to kind of, from a regulation standpoint, you have a kind of a window, and you have to actually pick a certain period of time, a week, where it's most likely to be one of those peak temperatures. So if that is June or it's August or late August, you know better the environment than we do. But usually it's kind of summer is summer for summer mapping is when you assume that it's the best time to perform the exercise, which is the riskiest time, or where actually the temperatures are the most extreme as
and I think also to add to what you're saying there, what we need to remember as well is that a mapping is a point in time measurement. So we're not only trying to define or find out whether the facilities or the temperature controlled units can handle those specific temperatures during summer. We're also trying to get some information in how should we monitor it after the mapping exercises, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily so that you'll find that it's operating well at 25 degrees and suddenly it becomes 30 degrees, that it will operate as well. But what you will have is information on where is the hot spot and the cold spot in the facility during these conditions. And then when you place constant monitoring in those positions and the temperature rises, we should be able to see whether we are experiencing non-compliant temperatures. So that's really the key point here is remember that we're doing point in time measurements, but we're also trying to assess where should we monitor afterwards.
Yeah.
So just having a warehouse with a mapping report that says compliant does not mean that it will stay that way. I think that's a very important key thing to take away from this.
100%, because the behavior of the unit can change based on the seasonality, right?
Absolutely.
And the same can be in winter. That's why in GxP industries, it is required most often than not to perform a summer and a winter mapping on a specific period.
Absolutely. Just because we're getting some questions here along the way. First of all, thank you very much for answering the poll. I'll close it down. It seems like a lot of people would want to be interested either for free or at a reasonable cost. So thank you very much for that. We'll definitely take that into consideration. There's a question here from Geir Foxe. Sorry if I mispronounced the name, but if a stability chamber has passed its validation process and is then subject to a variety of conditions, should you remap the required new set point? Hope that makes sense. Sorry. And yes, you should. So units that experience any changes in either technical installations, so it could be new doors, seals, compressors, what it might be, or changes in operations, so that also configurations should be remapped, because most likely the operation of the unit is not the same at that other set point than what the initial was. And that's really one of the key things we want to get across today here, is that you make your risk assessment based on how the system performs under certain conditions and whether you should explore those during the mapping or whether that can be transferred onwards. But without much further ado, we're going to take a look at sun and heating. So it's fairly important to remember that there are three types of energy transfer. There's convection, conduction, and radiation. And we always like to bring this small drawing here where we sort of see convection being the movement of the air because it heats up, and conduction being surfaces that touch each other often, and radiation basically being radiating heating. And during summertime, we'll experience all three of these. And a great example of this is this picture right here. We have sun-facing sites that might be heated up, that might heat up gates or walls, which if you have something touching them will get warm as well. Or you might have convection. So you can have convection starting on the inside of walls that will move around air in a different manner than it would during winter times. And on the other hand, during winter times, you'll probably often have radiators who work by radiation heating, hence the name radiators, right?
Yeah.
But the key fact here is that those conditions and those changes in conditions you have to take into account when doing your mapping protocol. And that really allows you to assess the risks related to this, but it also shows the auditors that you have this understanding of how the technical installations are, where there's insulation, where there's not doors and gates, which size are facing the sun of the building, for example, and that you have an idea of the operational, because another part of this where summer mappings basically play a role is in terms of outside air temperature, and that really is often related to sort of the operational risks that we can identify. First of all, for example, for power failure studies, it is really something where if there is a surrounding external influence where it's hotter during the summertime, well, most likely that power failure study is going to show that you have larger deviations or quicker deviations of temperature over time. And the same goes for door opening studies. If you identify any areas that are connected to the outside, for example, that can have an impact for door opening studies. So we often get asked, is it necessary to perform door opening studies both at wintertime and at summertime? And the question for that is really, does it matter? does the outside air temperature matter? Does it matter that it's warm outside? And that's really where you have to show the auditors that you are in control of your operations, so and your technical installations. So if you have doors that are directly connected to the outside, for example, it's an obvious yes. But there might be other areas where it's less obvious. So let's say you have a non-controlled area, and connected to that non-controlled area, you will have a cold room or a freeze room. If that non-controlled area is also affected by increasing outside air temperatures, well, then you do have to perform door opening studies during the summer period.
And also how much is influenced by those external, because for example some non-controlled areas can have a constant aircon system or heating system during the winter. In this case, perhaps in your risk assessment you'll be able to motivate that it's not really necessary because the temperature stays between 25 and 30 all year
Absolutely.
round.
Exactly. And just as you might have seen here, we'd just like to know if you would be interested in receiving an example of 3 typical summer mapping plans, just to give you some insights. We'll go through them today as well, but just click yes if you would like to receive them afterwards. And again, don't hold back if you have any questions during this. So moving onwards, another point that we often see that has an impact on the sort of operational changes that summer can have is in terms of equalizing product temperatures. So you might think, well, we do temperature controlled transport of our goods, and that's often true. But we do see, and we have a lot of experience in seeing that even though the transports are temperature controlled, they might be at elevated temperatures, still within the acceptable range, but at elevated temperatures. That's one thing. But another missed thing is also that you might have forklifts or other sort of operational equipment going in and out from outside to in. And if those are not at the temperature that they are during the summer, you might need to think into your processes, how do we equalize the product temperatures before we put them on long-term storage?
I have
Yes,
actually a question for you, right?
Yeah.
Let's because it's actually kind of connecting to the guy's question beforehand. But let's say assume that we change the roofing of our warehouse, and that impacts kind of course, the convection of the temperature within that. That means that we have to remap the whole warehouse once again.
It's a really good question. It's one of those questions that we get asked the most. So basically, what kind of changes, in what kind of scenarios do we need to remap the facility after changes? And it's really back to having a really strong foundation in your risk assessment, where you risk assess the different sections of your unit, not necessarily in a mapping protocol. Often the question would be yes, because it can have an enormous impact on the temperature distribution inside. Like if you're moving from one type of insulation to another type of insulation, that might not insulate as well. Or on the other hand, what we've actually, funnily enough, also seen is that you have a roof material that is suddenly way more, has a much better insulative, what do you call it?
Insulation itself,
way better insulation. And that actually meant that some of the air that previously moved around due to convection was suddenly not moving around anymore. And that caused some other issues. Often it's for the better, but we have seen places where it just changes the air distribution inside the facilities.
And also that means that you need to readjust your HVAC system based on those new findings, correct?
Exactly. So it's really, it often plays into a lot of different functionality of the system, the HVAC systems, whatever it might be, that some components which you did not think would have an impact on the control system suddenly has, right? So moving a bit on here. So trying to reiterate on all these different items and trying what are the specific areas of precision. And I'm just gonna go full screen here. What are the specific areas where it's truly interesting, or where we should have really a high amount of focus on during the summer mappings? First of all, we have these areas here connected where you might have people have access from the outside that is connected. Of course, that's what we've talked about. You might have outside air temperatures coming in that's non-compliant. You might have access from other parts of the building that are norm controlled, be it on one side or the other side of the building here. Another part that we talked about is really if you have these transit areas in which you receive goods and then they are therefore being equalized, those areas might also be affected by higher outside air temperatures. There's a really good question here from Amal on the way. How does a highly utilized HVAC system during summer months impact temperature mapping accuracy and consistency within a facility? Really good question, Amal. That's actually one of the other points here, is that we would often place a sensor in the blowout air of a HVAC system. So one of the typical causes of too cold air actually we see is that during the summer period, the HVAC system will need to work more than it. There's two parts to it. Both it has to blow out colder air in order to combat the surrounding elevated temperatures. So the air coming out of the HVAC system might be lower than what you're expecting, and it might be lower than the acceptable limit. That's one part. The other part is that typical air conditioned systems that blow out cold air, those tend to work in tandem. So they'll turn on for a period of time and then they shut off, and then another part of the system turn on, or it might have defreezing periods. But during summer periods, it might be constantly turned on, which means that ice starts to build on the condensators. It might not be able to follow up. So basically, after a period of time, it starts to get so cold that the system is overutilized and it can't really keep up with the increasing air temperatures. But one of the really hidden parts of this is that the system blows out too cold air. Yes, so there were some questions here. Great, it seems to have been solved pretty much. But really, in this image, it's important to note that the summer and the winter protocols should have fairly the same amount of loggers, or should be the same actually. We typically recommend to have the same positions during summertime and winter times. But what we're trying to emphasize here is basically that there are areas you should be more concerned about during the summertime. And when we see examples of protocols being written in such a way that you show that you have the knowledge to do the risk assessment of the individual seasons, you'll be at a very good point, because you show the auditor that you've thought about the risks that could occur during summertime and you thought about the risks that could occur during wintertime. And you'll hopefully go through the audit way easier. Yes, so there's another question here from Sagar. We're implementing a new temperature and humidity monitoring system provider. While mapping, should we test alarm testing? And is there any parameters that has to be focused to test during the mapping? So I think it's quite important to understand that, I think you got it all right, that we should have mapping and we should have alarm testing. It's a really good point, and those should be tested individually. But often we see that it's due to very good planning that you test those alarms during the mapping exercise, because that's most likely when you do not have any sensitive goods in there. So it's often way easier to test the alarm system during the mapping exercise, because you do not have the facility filled with storage. That being said, the mapping exercise should often be followed directly by a monitoring system in place. Either sometimes with UPRI system, for example, you can basically leave the sensors in place and they turn into a monitoring system, or be it any other system. And in terms of things to test during the mapping, the key points are, as Alex mentioned, you should identify the risks and the underlying risks. We always recommend that, or you can follow the sort of the rules of thumb, the guidelines. But basically, the major ones are that the temperature is homogeneous, so it's the same to a certain degree all around, that it's stable, that it doesn't vary up and down too much during the exercise, that it can handle the operational usage. So, I mean, if you have a warehouse and you open the doors and close them, you will do that during the normal operational phase, hopefully. Otherwise, it's a very useless warehouse if you don't open the doors, I think. So it should be able to handle those external influences, both during summer and during winter. And that's really what you want to show. And then, of course, we should ensure that there are no positions that experience out of scope temperatures and so forth. But it's really hard to find some specific points, but I would say those are the top ones. Moving on here, if there are any questions along the way, you're more than welcome to write them in the chat. We'll just try to follow up and see if there's any one we missed here. Other than that, we would actually love to see if you are actively doing a summer mapping this year. One of the experiences we often get is there's a high variability in terms of whether people perform summer mappings or not. So just put this one up there.
Maybe I have a question because you mentioned before, why the positioning of, let's say, sensors and all that should be kind of relatively the same between summer and winter? What's the underlying reason behind it?
That's a really good question, and there are also different schools of thought to this. Whether you are doing the same for summer and winter or doing differently, I would say either is fine. We would always recommend to have those the same because it gives you a much better picture when you're analyzing the data, so that you can actively pinpoint the differences. So how was this influenced by summer versus winter? You can only do that if you have the same positions during summer and winter.
For ease of comparability, kind of.
Yes, exactly. So being able to, and also being able to determine the hotspot during summer versus the hotspot during winter, is that the same? Or if not, should we consider having 2 hotspots and 2 cold spots? Cold spots. But it's one of the questions we get from time to time as well, and I've seen both strategies work with governmental authorities when doing the audit. But it's really up to an individual. But often there's also the reusability of the protocol. So one thing is writing a protocol twice versus once. It can often sort of be a time saver. A lot of people doing summer mappings this year, so thank you very much. Maybe Alex, a question for you as well, also related to some of the questions we got doing here. Do you see people having the hardest time performing the summer or winter mappings? I mean, are there something that you see being an issue again and again for some of the customers that we help?
I think, in my experience, summer mappings are a bit more implemented than the winter mapping. And that might be because I assume because some of the companies went through the comparability test in terms that they do once a protocol, and they do think that actually summer mapping, being the warmest period, being as well in the cold chain industry, is kind of the riskiest period to perform and the safest period. But I would say that summer mapping is the one that has more scrutiny compared to other seasonalities, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and also we do see there being a difference between where on the planet you're situated in terms of whether that makes sense a lot. I would say another key point also is that sometimes the risk analysis can basically help you eliminate some of the testing, because if you have ambient storage and the hottest time of the year is also happens to be around 20 degrees, we often see that you can write a risk assessment basically trying to explain why you do not have to perform a summer mapping in specific scenarios. So there's a really good question again from Saga here. Thank you very much. For temperature and humidity, if there is a separate hot and cold spot, should we consider both the spots for monitoring, or only temperature, hot and cold spots is sufficient for monitoring? So a really good question again, and we've gotten this several times. I would say I've seen 2 strategies being employed. One is where you have a summer hotspot and a winter hotspot, and then you switch the position between those 2, and one where you use 2 sensors for the hotspot, basically just to cover both the winter scenario and the summer scenario. I have seen cases of both strategies working, but I would say often the difficulty is in defining when do we switch over. One thing is sort of saying at the hottest period of time, that's our hotspot, and the coldest period of time, that's our hotspot. But the time in between there, you really don't know. So what we often recommend is saying you need those 2 positions covered by a sensor, so the 2 hotspots and the 2 cold spots. Let's say you have 2 different ones. But again, remembering that it is just a point in time measurement. So we're not necessarily sure that is true for all time.
Exactly. So probably the safest thing will be, because if we have kind of, because I don't know, maybe I understood differently the question, but if there is a separate hot and cold spots, like for between humidity, the temperature and humidity. So I understood maybe that there are two kind of risk areas. In in my opinion, if you have two risk areas, that means two sensors, two measuring points.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. What we're trying to basically monitor that we are sort of mitigating the risk of
Yeah.
us now having non-compliance in an area that is not monitored, right?
The rule of thumb will be kind of, after mapping, you should be fully aware of your kind of risk areas, and is where you should place your monitoring system,
Absolutely.
because that will might even optimize your monitoring system.
Absolutely. So there's a really good question here from John. If you have walk-in -20 and -40 freezer environments with an ambient controlled environment, can you reasonably argue in a risk assessment that no summer mapping is needed? Yes, and that's the norm we do. One thing to keep in mind is that the ambient controlled storage in which you have these freezer rooms needs to be actively controlled.
Yeah.
What we've seen several cases of is basically that clients or some of our customers will be quite sure that the ambient storage is controlled when in reality it's not. Back to our point before, so the strategy is often considering, is this room connected to any other non-controlled rooms, not necessarily just the door, but also all the surrounding walls, so that it's not a conductive heating, so that you have like a wall connected to something that's non-controlled. And also during the mapping study to have a sensor outside the room measuring the temperatures of the outside air, because that might impact the temperatures. And what we also do see orders in increasing degree ask for is say, okay, if your argument is that this is a temperature controlled room, do you have monitoring on it? Because it's not necessarily so that it will stay controlled temperature. But yes, in the case where you are absolutely sure that the temperature is controlled, you can argue, and we often do that summer mappings are not necessary. And the same goes for fridges and freezers and other
Exactly.
temperature controlled units,
I
right?
mean, an auditor might ask you, how do you know that it's between 15 and 30 degrees? Kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Um,
do we have
yes.
any more polls?
I think that's pretty much it.
Okay.
And thank you very much today, and thank you very much for all the great questions. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and on our webpage. And we every single month we have, and this month we actually have 2 webinars, but
Exactly.
all the months we have webinars connected to mapping, calibrations, compliance. And we'll be very much looking for the next webinar, which will be based on the topic of creating URSs, user requirement specifications for temperature controlled units and for monitoring systems. So thank you very much, and have a lovely evening from here.
Thank you, and yeah, see ya.